It's late, but we're here. And it's nice to have this number of visitors because it's an important issue that people need to know more about. So I hope each of you will take what you learn and spread the word to your friends on social media and your friends that are wherever. Mr. Wilson, good to have you here with us this important hearing. We found out, unfortunately, this morning that great friend of the Commission's, Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is imprisoned in Russia, has been moved out of his prison. And Russia has not let anybody know, his family or anybody, where he's being taken to. They just decided out of nowhere. They wanted to take him at one point to Moscow for a hearing, and he objected to that, didn't want to leave for the hearing, he wanted to do it remotely, and they did it remotely. But now they're moving him to parts unknown. But he was in Omsk in Siberia. Who knows where he'll be. We also learned, I guess, that the New York Times writer is going to be tried for treason, espionage, whatever he's going to be tried for. So Russia's up to their old tricks. Vladimir will be receiving an award tonight with his wife Evgenia for human rights, and he certainly deserves it. And he raises the level of all the people that have been honored in the past, because he's a wonderful man, and his imprisonment is something that is despicable and part of what Russia's been doing, this stomping on dissent. I am the OSCE parliamentary representative, special representative of political prisoners, and I was suggested I take this position. It was Vladimir asked me to take it, and I was happy to do it. But at that time, I knew he was going to be arrested. He had been twice poisoned, survived the poisonings, although the second one particularly, it caused him quite a few months of treatment, and he was on death's doorstep. But he still went back to Russia because he said, I am a Russian citizen, and I cannot operate outside of Russia and be a Russian politician and work for a free and democratic Russia. So he went back and been arrested and sentenced to 25 years. That is what we have going. And then, of course, Belarus, we welcome my friend Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, Skaya. Thank you. When he gets it right and I get it wrong, I'm in real trouble. But thank you. You are a hero, too, and I admire you over the years, and I know you're recognized. And what's happened with Belarus, I've met Lukashenko. He's the central casting couldn't have a better person for being an autocrat, bully than Lukashenko, and he plays the role well, and he likes it. Well, he's a bad guy, but we're happy that you're here with us and can tell us more about what's going on in Belarus and all the people that have been imprisoned there. We think it's close to 1,600 political prisoners, including your husband. The times I visited Belarus, there were 2 occasions, the NGOs always told us about how difficult it was to operate as an NGO there and the horror stories, and so it's played out well, so just quote unquote. This particular, we at the OSCE and the Helsinki Commission have a strong belief in people's having a right to speak up, democratic rule, and transparency, and that's something these autocrats don't believe in. So that's a problem. I look forward to hearing from our 3 witnesses. Joe, do you have a statement?
Yes, I do.
Please.
Thank you very much, Acting Chairman. And ladies and gentlemen and friends of freedom and democracy, I'm so grateful to be here. And today we'll address a grave and pressing issue that strikes at the heart of our democratic values and the principles of human rights, the plight of political prisoners worldwide. And I'm actually pleasantly surprised to be here with 3 people worldwide recognized as heroines of freedom and democracy. And I can't believe my staff didn't tell me that I was going to have 3 superstars here today. And so God bless each of you for what you do on behalf of political prisoners. Political prisoners are individuals detained for their beliefs, expressions, and activism. They are men and women who have dared to challenge oppressive regimes, advocate for freedom, and demand justice. Their courage is met not with dialogue, but with imprisonment, torture, and often death. The world is in a global conflict of dictators with rule of gun invading democracies with rule of law. As Americans, we have a moral obligation to stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. Our nation's history is rooted in the fight against tyranny and the unwavering belief in liberty and justice for all. And as I mentioned to you, I've got my symbol here of Normandy. I was there last week, and how incredible it was. The bravery of American troops landing at Omaha Beach, 9,930 killed and wounded, and the unique nature of the United States to conquer France, Europe, but we didn't stay. We only asked for space to bury our dead, and I was there at the Normandy Cemetery. And so America continues to be rooted in a fight against tyranny and unwavering belief in liberty and justice for all. We cannot turn a blind eye to the suffering of political prisoners, nor can we remain silent in the face of systematic persecution by dictatorial regimes. Finally, we must recognize the widespread nature of this issue. From the campus of Xinjiang in Tibet, where Uyghur Muslims and Buddhists are detained and subject to inhumane treatment, to the jails of Belarus, where opposition leaders are silenced, the oppression is pervasive. In dictatorial countries like Iran, Venezuela, the Russian Federation, and many others, political prisoners face brutal conditions, stripped of their basic human rights. It's imperative that we hold these governments accountable. Accountability can take many forms, including sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and international condemnation. We must leverage our influence in international bodies to push for resolutions that condemn and take actions against such practices. Furthermore, we must enact legislation, and it'll be bipartisan. Can you imagine? Democrat, Republican, together here. But it will be bipartisan, with legislation that targets individuals and entities responsible for these human rights abuses, ensuring that they face consequences to their actions. Our response cannot be limited to punitive measures. We must also extend our support to the families of political prisoners. These families often endure significant emotional and financial hardships, with in many cases breadwinners unjustly imprisoned and their sources of livelihood disrupted. They live in a state of constant fear and uncertainty, grappling with the absence of their loved ones and the threat of retaliation. We must provide these families with tangible support. This can be including humanitarian aid, legal assistance, advocacy to amplify their voices on the international stage, as we've done against the dictatorship of Assad in Syria. By partnering with non-governmental organizations and human rights groups, we can ensure that families of political prisoners receive the resources and support they desperately and deservedly need. The plight of political prisoners is not merely a policy issue, it is a human issue. It's about standing up for the inherent dignity and rights of every individual. As a nation that cherishes freedom and justice, we must lead by example and take decisive action. Let Americans work together, Democrats and Republicans, to hold oppressive regimes accountable, support the families of those unjustly imprisoned, and reaffirm our commitment to the principles that define us as an America that stands for freedom and democracy. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson, and we will start our witnesses.
And Mr. Chair, I'm in the education workforce, and we're voting now, so I know I'm leaving in terrific hands. Thank you.
Thank you. Our first witness will be Ms. Tikhanovskaya. I've never been good with that, and I apologize. National leader of Belarus. She won the presidential election August 9, 2020 against the long-lasting dictator Lukashenko. Her story began when she entered the race after her husband announced he wanted to run and voiced his presidential aspirations, and I think that resulted in him being incarcerated. Is that right? Yeah. And then you announced that you were going to run, and Mr. Lukashenko said, no, you're a housewife. A woman can't be president. Well, you've united people and successfully led the Democratic coalition from Lithuania. Is that correct? Yeah. And following that forced exile, where a lot of people from Belarus have gone, she's become a symbol of peaceful struggle for democracy and has inspired unprecedented peaceful protests in Belarus, some numbering as many as hundreds of thousands. Dozens of distinctions, the Sakharov Prize awarded by the European Parliament, the 2022 International Four Freedoms Award, and the Charlemagne Prize. I can say we've been together many times, and wherever we've been together, she's been greeted with a deserved adulation for your heroism, your courage. You're recognized.
Thank you, Co-Chair Cohen, the members of the Commission, the witness. Many of you know me as the winner of the presidential elections, but primarily I'm the wife of political prisoner. Today I speak on behalf of millions of Belarusians held hostages by the Lukashenko's illegitimate regime. The regime is still taking revenge on our people for our peaceful uprising in 2020, for our desire to live in democracy and freedom. Since then, our country, Belarus, increasingly resembles a huge prison, whilst the prisons have become torture chambers. Human rights defenders know the names at least 1,500 political prisoners. In the US, that would be the equivalent to 45,000. Every single day, 15-20 people are being detained on trumped-up charges. Liking a post on Instagram, wearing socks of wrong color, singing Ukrainian song, or even speaking the Belarusian language, all of this can land you in jail. Their only goal is to terrify people and suppress our will for resistance. Many are imprisoned not for what they did, but what they might do. George Orwell found the perfect term for that: thought crime. Many arrests are based on denouncements, like in Stalin's time. Recently, Belarusian cyber partisans hacked the KGB database and leaked 9,000 emails sent by KGB informants. It's horrible to see such penetration by state police in all spheres of life. And when you are in the hands of the KGB, your chance of getting released is close to zero. They would record a confessional video where you plead guilty for crimes you have never committed. The KGB put these videos on YouTube as advertisements to seed fear and feeling of hopelessness. The regime is trying either to break you or force you to collaborate. Remember Roman Protasevich, journalist kidnapped for a commercial plane forced to land in Minsk? He started to collaborate with the regime, appeared on a TV, praised the dictator, and denounced his friends. People behind bars are totally isolated. Maybe once a day they can see the sky during a short walk in the prison yard. They are deprived of medical, legal aid, or communication with the world. It took months for some to know that the war in Ukraine had ever begun. What this evil system is doing to our loved ones has a name, and it's called torture. There is another form of torture for them and their families, incommunicado. It's when political prisoners don't receive a single word from their relatives. Most mothers can live a day without calling and checking how the child is, but parents of political prisoners don't have this luxury. For more than a year now, I haven't heard anything from my husband, who was sentenced to 19 years in prison, and I don't even know if he is alive. Our son and daughter continue writing him letters and never get any answers. The only information we have received are anonymous messages with hopefully fake news about his death. And this is happening to many. Radio Free Europe journalist Igor Losik, lawyer Maxim Znak, my friend Maria Kolesnikova, former presidential hopeful Viktor Babarika, politician Mikolai Statkevich, and historian Vladimir Gundel. They were sentenced to 15, 10, 11, 14, and 20 years in prison. At least another 250 political prisoners are in mortal danger. 6 have already died. We compiled a humanitarian list. This list includes 16 people with disabilities, 91 with serious illnesses, 65 senior citizens, 10 people with mental disorders, 23 minors. At least 5 families have both parents in prison. All of them must be released immediately. More than 1,600 people have already served their terms. They need rehabilitation, relocation to safe countries. Last month, together with Norway, we launched the humanitarian fund to support Belarusian political prisoners, and I hope the United States will contribute as well. The regime also hunts those who managed to flee Belarus. Today, a Serbian court decided to extradite an activist, Andrei Gnot, on the request of Belarus regime sent through Interpol. We mustn't allow this to happen. And I hope the United States will take a strong stance to protect not only Andrei, but all Belarusians who found a safe haven in the United States and all over the world. Political prisoners are not only a political issue, but also humanitarian. I ask the US to support our call to the UN General Secretary to provide access to those behind bars, give them medical and legal assistance, put pressure on the regime to release political prisoners, increase assistance to Belarusian civil society, human rights defenders, and families of the repressed. We must bring perpetrators to justice. Judges, prosecutors, administrators of colonies, propagandists, Lukashenko and all his cronies. They must know that every crime will be documented and prosecuted. Adopt the Belarus Democracy Act, which has been introduced to the House and Senate. Appoint a special envoy to Belarus. We need the voice of the US government keeping Belarus high on the agenda. Belarusians need US leadership to help release political prisoners. In the end, I want to thank the US Congress, State Department, and the White House for your consistent solidarity and assistance. In the last few days, I had many powerful meetings here in DC, and I know that you are on our side. Thank you.
You're very welcome. I appreciate your testimony. We are on your side, and we understand the difficulties in Belarus. I mean, after the election, he just swarmed up everybody. And he's a bad guy. Our next witness is a special rapporteur, Suna. You want to give me your last name? You got that? And she has served as the General Rapporteur for Political Prisoners for the Council of Europe's Parliamentary Assembly since May of 2023. Member of the Icelandic delegation to PACE since 2017, and additionally is third vice chairperson of the Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights, and is a member of the Committee on Rules and Procedures and Institutional Affairs. Icelandic Member of Parliament since 2016, where she's been the second Deputy Chair of Economic Affairs and Trade Committee since 2021, and Deputy Chair of the Delegation of the Council of European Parliamentary Assemblies since 21. She sat on the Parliamentary Committees on Judicial Affairs, Education, Constitution, Supervision, Industrial Affairs, and will bring us testimony. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair Cohen. I see. Thank you very much, Co-Chair Cohen. Distinguished Commission, ladies and gentlemen. Imprisoning people for expressing their opinions is a lethal weapon against democracy. Criminalizing dissent is one of the most effective measures to drain the life out of any democratic society, and creating an atmosphere of fear, repression, and persecution of any opposition is a necessary precondition for totalitarian rule. Moreover, as Mr. Vladimir Kara-Murza, one of more than 1,000 of Russia's political prisoners, has often stated, internal suppression always leads to external aggression. It is therefore an honor to address the Helsinki Commission today as the General Rapporteur of Political Prisoners of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, a body representing 700 million Europeans and 46 member states. I strongly believe that together we can significantly strengthen our efforts to free political prisoners and call the governments responsible for their imprisonment to account. It's a privilege to speak alongside Madam Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the legitimate leader of Belarus. Her husband, held in incommunicato detention since March last year, is sadly among the more than 1,500 political prisoners of the Lukashenko regime in Belarus. My mandate compels me to intervene in matters relating to alleged cases of politically motivated arrests and criminal prosecutions in Europe and in other countries having an observer or cooperative status with the Council of Europe. During my mandate, I have intervened in numerous cases originating from Russia, Belarus, Turkey, Azerbaijan, to name the countries with the largest numbers of political prisoners in Europe. I have written reports and resolutions regarding political prisoners in Azerbaijan, Russia, Belarus, in occupied Crimea, and most recently, I have started work on a report focusing on whether the detention and prosecution of Julian Assange can be considered as politically motivated. Moving on to the Assembly's definition of political prisoner, established in Assembly Resolution 1900 from 2012. Broadly speaking, the Assembly considers a person to be a political prisoner if he or she is deprived of liberty in circumstances suggesting a violation of fundamental freedoms, such as freedom of expression, for purely political reasons, or in clearly unfair or disproportionate manner in connection with political motives. As rapporteur, I have met with many current and previous political prisoners and countless members of their family. Although all of their cases are different from one another, what unites them is their need for our support and for their voices to be heard across the world. Because the greatest fear of any political prisoner is to be forgotten, to quote again my good friend Vladimir Kara-Murza. Turning, therefore, to what can be done. In our resolutions on the subject of political prisoners, we've called for our member and observer states to grant visas or asylum requests from former political prisoners and their family members, as well as to others exposed to the risk of political imprisonment, and to refuse politically motivated extradition requests. We have advocated for prisoner swaps, and in my view, perhaps the strongest weapon or tool to work against political imprisonment is targeted sanctions. In this regard, the leading role of the US Congress should be commended. In particular, Senator Benjamin Cardin, Senator Roger Wicker, and the late Senator John McCain, who co-sponsored the Magnitsky Act, a legislative initiative that has gone global, imposing targeted sanctions on human rights violators, enjoying impunity in their own countries. And our co-chair, Mr. Cohen, for inviting us here to discuss this important topic and for his important work at the OSCE on the subject. The effectiveness of Magnitsky sanctions is undisputed. In fact, Vladimir Kara-Murza's 25-year sentence is seen as revenge, not only for his openly expressed anti-war stance, but also for his campaign alongside Bill Browder, calling for Magnitsky laws all over the world. Indeed, just calling for sanctions against oppressive regimes can help free political prisoners, demonstrated by the recent example of Dr. Gubat Ibadoglu's release from an Azerbaijani prison following the legislative initiative of Congressman Chris Smith. I believe that the increased cooperation between the Council of Europe and the United States can only strengthen our fight for the freedom of political prisoners. And let me name just one idea in closing that I think could be a helpful note. I believe that the joint establishment of the International Day of Political Prisoners, possibly on October 30th, could be a good opportunity to call for the release of political prisoners and to hold regular exchanges on the subject. I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to our exchange of views. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony and, more importantly, your work. Our next witness will be Miss Annie Boyajian.
We brought you the easy names today.
Excuse me?
We brought you the easy names today.
Yeah, right, I know, yeah. Vice President of Policy and Advocacy at Freedom House and serves as the Mark Palmer Distinguished Fellow. She oversees Freedom House's policy and advocacy work, including engagement with the U.S. government and in collaboration with American human rights groups. Continues tributes to Freedom House publications, et cetera, et cetera. Welcome.
Ranking Member Cohen, members of the Commission, it's an honor to testify today. According to Freedom House data, political rights and civil liberties have declined worldwide for 18 consecutive years. Across the Eurasia region, we have documented 20 consecutive years of decline, driven by worsening repression in autocracies and backsliding in democracies. As repression intensifies, regimes often turn to political imprisonment as a tool of control. In the OSCE region, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, Turkey, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan all utilize political imprisonment. Russia, of course, uses political imprisonment not just to repress people in Russia, but also thousands of Ukrainian civilians, including children. The U.S. Department of State estimates that there are more than 1 million political prisoners worldwide. Political prisoners are routinely subjected to deplorable conditions, including torture and denial of access to lawyers, family, and medical care. Imprisonment also carries heavy psychological and financial burdens extended to prisoners' families. Sadly, there are too many political prisoners to name them all, but my written testimony provides details about several cases and the conditions that prisoners face. There are several areas of concern related to political imprisonment that I would like to highlight today. First, incommunicado detention, which you've heard Ms. Sikhanouskaya mention in relation to her own husband, and then we've also just heard about Mr. Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is also being held incommunicado. Second, the targeting of lawyers who represent political prisoners is also widespread across the region. This matters because, as Vadim Prokhorov, a Russian human rights lawyer who represents Mr. Kara-Murza, wrote, lawyers of political prisoners help them maintain connections with the outside world. It gives those defendants a chance to have their cases heard in court and brought to public attention. Without lawyers, political prisoners would suffer even more, and they would do so in obscurity. Third, for every political prisoner behind bars, many more face subtler constraints, as our research has documented. Tactics include denying someone the ability to travel, physical monitoring, blacklisting from employment or government services, and seizure of assets. These measures can be formally or informally applied with or without notice and effectively prevent individuals from participating normally in society, something that some experts call civil death. Fourth, arresting those who dissent is not just about instilling fear, it is about creating perverse incentives to seek concessions from the democratic community. We see this clearly in Russia, where the Kremlin has arrested several American nationals, and we have family members of some of those folks in the room today. Autocracies also routinely resort to what we call a revolving door of political imprisonment, releasing some but simultaneously arresting others. For political prisoners, international attention can mean the difference between life and death. We have many recommendations on the Freedom House website, but I would like to highlight a few today. First, governments should establish a dedicated office or team within the Foreign Affairs Ministry specifically focused on political prisoner and hostage issues. Appointing dedicated staff to work on this issue, both publicly and behind the scenes, will streamline existing efforts to free political prisoners and facilitate knowledge sharing and coordination with like-minded governments. Second, government officials should raise political prisoners and their treatment in all meetings and at all levels, and in international forums. And we would like to commend the Helsinki Commission for your leadership and consistency on this issue. Thank you. Third, embassy personnel should attend and monitor trials and hearings for those facing politically motivated charges or already in detention, and should visit detention facilities to assess needs. Fourth, governments should support the relocation of human rights defenders at serious risk of political imprisonment or civil death. In the United States, the Human Rights Defenders Protection Act would create a special non-immigrant visa to enable human rights defenders under threat to temporarily relocate to the US, where they could continue their work until it's safe to return home. Fifth, targeted sanctions against officials involved in political imprisonment should be more vigorously deployed as part of a comprehensive approach to addressing the use of political imprisonment. Global Magnitsky, which we heard mentioned, and Section 7031C sanctions programs both already cover enforced disappearances and arbitrary detention. But it can be challenging to clearly determine whether or not a detention is arbitrary. To make things clear, Congress should urge the White House to issue a proclamation that clearly states that arbitrary detention is considered a serious human rights abuse and gross violation of human rights for the purposes of Global Magnitsky and Section 7031C. This was done for other issues and has proven helpful. Finally, donors should continue to provide financial assistance to cover the legal expenses incurred by political prisoners and their families. Political prisoners are often jailed because they represent a direct threat to the regimes by working toward a future of freedom and hope. Support for political prisoners today is a direct investment in the democratic future of their countries tomorrow. Until that day comes, we are honored to stand with all of you in this struggle. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Let me start the questioning, and I may finish the questioning too, unless my compadres show up. In Belarus, has there been any change in the level of imprisonment of political prisoners since the 2020-21 elections? They arrested so many people then, but since then, has there been any change in the methodology of Lukashenko in arresting Belarusian citizens who object to his rule in the fraudulent election? Or have people just been less opposing and presenting themselves as opposition?
So first of all, I have to say that Belarusian people live in the country as in Stalin's time, in full tyranny and repressions. Of course, the aim of Lukashenko is to suppress people and showing political prisoners and they confessional video constantly, putting on propagandistic TV, all those messages about that everybody who's opposing regime or supporting Ukrainians in the war will be detained. Of course, it's frightens people. And honestly speaking, since 2020, repressions, detentions haven't stopped for a day. Every day in Belarus, 15, 20 people are being detained. Just in May only, 145 people were detained, and there is 31 women among them.
Were these people that were demonstrating somewhere, or were they just chosen by the authorities?
No, it's revenge for 2020 uprising, but also it's revenge for uprising in February 2022, when there are massive demonstrations against the war. And now you can be detained for anything. You don't have to be on the streets, opposing the regime. You can, donate Ukrainian army €5, you'll be detained for 5 years for this. You can speak Belarusian language, you can buy Belarusian books, you can, show solidarity and help families of political prisoners who are in dire also situation. Your solidarity is a crime at the moment. So you also a new wave of persecution of people is when people are active in exile. At least 500,000 Belarusians left Belarus since 2020, and if they're demonstrating in exile, or if they are politically active, or if they support political prisoners from exile, their relatives in Belarus are under attack. Their property is confiscated, in Belarus. So it's like if Lukashenko's regime can't reach people physically, they reach their relatives. So, and it's constant Lukashenko's message. So if you're active politically, if you are supporting the idea of sanctions, if you're supporting political prisoners, be ready to lose your property and think about your relatives. This is clear message.
Have there been any releases of prisoners in the last 5 years?
At the moment, we have at least 1,600 political prisoners, ex-political prisoners, who have served their terms. So no pardons, no pardoning of people. So these people fully, from bell to bell sentence, served their terms. And
they're released after they've served their time?
Yes, some are released, some are not. We have cases when there's time when a person has to be released and relatives are waiting for this time, and already in prison, this political prisoner is accused, one more, accusation, and his term is continuing, and it can be endlessly, endlessly. Like recently, our Belarusian activist Polina Sharenda-Panasiuk, woman, her husband with 2 children, we were waiting for her just 1 month ago, and she wasn't released. Though they showed her in a propagandistic channel, and sometimes it helped people to get released faster. They used her but didn't release. It's it's revenge on the strength of this woman.
Revenge is a term we've heard lately quite a bit from one of the potential candidates for president, and he thinks it's a good thing.
Yeah.
You mentioned, and I think each of you mentioned, sanctions as a way to try to force releases of political prisoners. Can you cite any examples where sanctions or the increase in sanctions have resulted in the release of political prisoners?
I don't have a specific example of that on the top of my mind. I think it has actually possibly even led to, for instance, our friend Vladimir Kara-Murza being faced with such serious charges. What it does, however, is lift the impunity for these serious human rights violations. It makes it harder for instance, Vladimir Putin and his cronies to continue disrespecting any and all of international laws dealing with fair trial, fair process, and democracy and the rule of law, if we are going over there as well. What it does is make it more difficult for officials to participate in these things, for them to enjoy their time in the sun, going to different countries in Europe to buy luxury goods and benefit from their often very corrupt process, very corrupt actions that also result in political prisoners, as we saw in the case of Magnitsky, that involved insane amounts of money, so that I phrase it rather delicately. So what the importance of targeted sanctions is for the international community to show that it will cost your wallet if you are willing to violate people's fundamental human rights and your state isn't willing to do anything about it. So it attacks the impunity aspect of political imprisonment, which is one of the main facets of what allows it to continue, is that autocratic governments allow it to continue. But of course, just like I mentioned in my address, sometimes just naming possibility of sanctions is enough to get a political prisoner released. I mentioned Dr. Dr. Gubat Ibadoglu, who was released after a member of Congress here suggested there should be sanctions against Azerbaijan. I think the sensitivities of governments are also, they differ. Some feel quite confident that they will not be made to feel any real consequences, and we can point to examples like Turkey, who has a significant number of political prisoners. Some might say they have over 40,000 people imprisoned on political grounds, but due to their strategic and political status in the international legal order, they don't really have to face a lot of consequences for that, despite this very widespread lack of the rule of law and real judicial oversight to politically motivated prosecutions. So we also must ask ourselves, where do we draw the line in the sand? We should be imposing targeted sanctions against all states that have systematic problems when it comes to political persecution. And I'm naming here specifically the biggest offenders in Europe, which are Belarus, Russia, Turkey, and Azerbaijan. And these, I think, are, hotspots that we really should focus on, because we will pay the price later if we do not act and if we do not focus on calling those to account that are responsible for it, because we will see a further deterioration of the state of rule of law in these countries. And so that I quote Vladimir again, internal suppression will always lead to external aggression. So it is important that we hold these governments to account.
I presume the two of you agree that sanctions is probably our best tool. Is that correct?
I would certainly say it's a very important tool. It cannot be the only tool. I think it needs to be part of a comprehensive strategy. But I would say in the U.S. especially, we have a lot more room to try sanctions specifically against individuals who are engaging in political imprisonment. Human Rights First has done some excellent research that showed from the beginning of implementation of Global Magnitsky Act through the end of 2022, arbitrary detention was mentioned as one of many reasons in the sanctions designation, but actually in 2023, sanctions for Mr. Vladimir Kara-Murza's jailers, 3 Russians, were sanctioned by the U.S. That was the first time the U.S. had arbitrary detention of a single person as the sole reason for the sanction. So there's a lot more room for us to try, and we should.
What I know that, sanctions is not silver bullet, but sanctions help to weaken the regime, to help to empty their pockets, that, they can give this money to Siloviki, to military forces, just to detain and terrorize people. But sanctions should be, harmonized For example, in the case of Belarus and Russia, on Belarus, most sanctions are imposed on import, on Russia on export. And two dictators using each other, circumvent sanctions very easily. And for us, people of Belarus, and maybe for opposition from Russia, it seems like one hand is trying to help political prisoners, trying to help Ukrainians to win this war, and the other hand is feeding the regime, continuing trading with them. So synchronization of sanctions, we are asking Europe, to watch what the USA is doing with secondary sanctions that are rather effective. But of course, sanctions have to be, they have to be not the only tool. Positive messages to Belarusians and other people who are fighting with dictatorship are also very important. Because when I always ask allies of democratic forces of Belarus, isolate Lukashenko's regime, but don't isolate people. It's so important to show people that, the doors of democratic world is opened for you, that you are welcomed. We are weakening the regime, but strengthening people, strengthening national identity, strengthening alternative media, NGOs and so on and so forth. So people need energy to continue fight for political prisoners and fight for the country.
Are there other things you can recommend to the United States or to the European Council or the United Nations for that matter that could be done to bring more pressure and maybe result in some releases?
I think a lot more can be done when it comes to the United Nations, for instance, in calling Belarusian authorities as well as Russian authorities to account for these imprisonments. I also mentioned in passing prisoner swaps, which I think are in many cases almost the only option to secure the release of political prisoners, in particular those who we believe are, justified to fear that their lives are in danger or they have serious health concerns. And there, the United States is, of course, a very strong player in this field and the ability to be able to trade with nations that are willing to exchange people like that. So this, among also what Madam Tikhanovskaya mentioned in supporting independent media, supporting NGOs that have connections to people on the ground. So you have an NGO in exile in, let's say, Lithuania that has connections with people that are in the opposition on the ground in Belarus or in Russia, where civil society has mostly had to go underground. They continue their activities, but they have to do it a lot more secretly than before, because what we've seen, of course, especially after the full-scale invasion into Ukraine, is that these two states have intensified their draconian legislation, which was already very severe, but they have added, I've called it the unmasking of the Russian regime, this new approach that they have towards political imprisonment, whereas before they would find some fake reason for persecuting political prisoners. They would accuse them of drug smuggling or child molestation or all sorts of trumped up charges, but they would at least make up a facade of making it look real. But what they've done now is sort of just drop the mask and say, it's enough to criticize us and we can put you in prison. That's what their laws now say. And the same goes for Belarus. These actions have intensified greatly. So I think that justifies escalating things at the United Nations. I'm thinking about strengthening the sanctions system because, as was mentioned by Madam Tikhanovskaya, they are not fully effective, and there are many ways of circumventing it, and there are also ways of attacking that, and I think that we should be focusing on how best to do that.
Are there any voices in the Belarusian parliament to question Lukashenko and speak up for the political prisoners, or is that just a recipe for disaster?
There is... parliament in Belarus is like pocket parliament of Lukashenko. Nobody there is going to ask questions to these dictators. Their task is just to raise hands when it's necessary for Lukashenko's regime. So in Belarus, elections has nothing in common with elections. Parliament has nothing in common with the parliament in democratic sense of this word. So we can't rely on institutions inside Belarus. because Lukashenko built such a system that is obeying, personally to him. It's not serving to people of Belarus. So that's why we rely a lot on democratic world, on your institutions. And regarding what else can be done, I think that all the accountability mechanisms has to be used more effectively. Because in the case of Belarus, we have all the proofs of Lukashenko and his cronies' crimes against humanity, crimes of aggression, abduction of Ukrainian children, migration crisis, so on and so forth. But no one special investigation has been launched or has been started against Lukashenko's regime, against all the perpetrators. We know the proofs of these crimes. Why so? That's the question. Why don't you use, democratic world doesn't use all the tools and instruments you have. You have international courts, court of justice, criminal court. There is such a mechanism as universal jurisdiction. So use it effectively. Show to people who are fighting with for release of political prisoners against dictators that democratic world is working.
And you feel comfortable and safe in Lithuania where you are? Is there any Belarusian underground or officials that have come over there and threatened you or anybody else that's taken political refuge there?
Look, all those people who fled Belarus, they're also targets of the regime. And nobody can feel safe, not inside the country, not outside. Even if we live in European countries or, or in the USA, we physically in safe space. But look, our relatives in Belarus, you can't feel safe. Every day, you feel pain for people in prisons, for hostages of the regime in Belarus, so you don't think about your safety, you think about safety of your country and people.
Thank you.
I would love to add the issue that Ms. Tikhanovskaya is talking about of this targeting of individuals even after they've fled their home countries is what is known as transnational repression, and we've actually done quite a bit of research on that at Freedom House. So we have a database that looks at instances of direct physical transnational repression. So the most famous case of this is Jamal Khashoggi, right? But it's also things like being followed physically, being beaten up or attacked. And we use only open source information that we can cite to. And within those constraints, which suggests that what we are documenting is a drop in the bucket, we have still documented between 2014 and the end of 2023, more than 1,000 instances perpetrated by 44 countries in more than 100 other countries. And that's, more than 20% of the world's government. That's a very shocking fact. And when you think about the impact that has on democracies, a lot of times when people hear about political prisoner issues, they think it's not worth raising because this is some domestic issue in some far-flung place. And in fact, when repression intensifies enough that folks have to flee abroad, it becomes a global issue. I would say one other thing that you asked about, what else can be done? It's actually a very low-cost action, and that's simply just raising cases. And sometimes democracies do this very, very well, and again, we would commend the Helsinki Commission, but sometimes, quite frankly, we don't. And in the case of Azerbaijan, Leyla and Arif Yunus were released 5-ish years ago after a very high-level phone call from officials in the United States. So to the folks listening today who are policymakers, please don't underestimate your power in raising names. And we are, in democracies, not great at doing this with countries where we feel like we have other interests, but especially in those moments, we have such leverage. It would be such a waste not to raise political prisoner issues.
Well, we try to raise them. That's something we try to get at, but you don't get a lot of response sometimes. There's not, unfortunately, the public has not risen up in some ways and tried to express their voices as well, which we need to have. Now, you mentioned Khashoggi. You have no question that the Saudis were responsible for that, do you?
Well, we don't have access to classified materials. Of course, the information released in the press suggests that the CIA found that the Saudis were responsible, and indeed the United States did impose sanctions on several individuals, I think it was 44, who were supposedly involved in that case. It was not global Magnitsky sanctions, which allow you to publicly name the perpetrator. The U.S. actually used a different mechanism, which was a visa ban. So we don't know the names of all of those individuals. And then I think there were a few cases where sanctions did publicly release names. But that is definitely, the Khashoggi case is definitely the emblematic case that we talk about when we're trying to explain to people what transnational repression is.
Does Bill Browder have a second level that he wants to pursue on sanctions or Magnitsky type?
Well, there are a number of countries that now have Magnitsky regimes, but they don't all incorporate corruption. So I know that that's something you may be able to speak to, General Rapporteur. But the UK, the EU, several Baltic nations have regimes. And actually, there has been some really good effort at coordination. A couple of years ago, there were joint sanctions issued on individuals in China who were involved in abuses in Xinjiang. But I think there still is quite a bit of room to grow.
Yes, many more people can be added to these Magnitsky lists. For example, in the EU, as far as last time I checked, they hadn't included the people responsible for the death of Sergei Magnitsky in their own Magnitsky legislation. So there is room for growth in the utilization of these Magnitsky laws. And I think that, as I referred to in my speech, what shows their efficacy is the level of vehemency that Mr. Karamurza has faced because of his involvement in the campaign, because it really has negatively affected the close allies of Putin and his regime, and this makes it more difficult for him to operate and maintain control. I also would like to say that I think that the importance of granting visa and assisting with travel documents can't be understated here when it comes to the support of political prisoners and their families. A recent example of Belarus refusing to issue passports to people outside of Belarus is something that I think we really should be looking into with all seriousness, because if we end up in a situation where many Belarusians might end up facing deportation because they don't have travel documents or what have you, we would be sending them back to the hands of Lukashenko and basically letting him play out his plan, which is to isolate Belarusians outside of Belarus and make it impossible for them to do their work and live their life normally. What we should also be looking into is the misuse of counterterrorism and money laundering measures against human rights defenders and political prisoners and their families. So countries that have a high incidence of political imprisonment and repression against NGOs and human rights defenders have a tendency to use the international systems that we use to flag suspicious activity when it comes to money laundering and terrorism charges, just as they have the incidence of requesting extraditions or red notices, as was made quite famous by Bill Browder's book, to use against political dissidents and their families. So what this does is make it impossible for them to travel. They will get arrested where they go. They face possibly being extradited to the country that wants to imprison them. And on top of that, with these anti-terrorism and anti-corruption measures, they will have a very difficult time opening a bank account, receiving money transfers, even using Western Union, having any means of sustenance really wherever it is that they choose to reside outside of their own country. So these are all measures that are used to make the life of political prisoners and their families or previous political prisoners unbearable. And we need to find a way to strike the right balance between the very legitimate goal of combating terrorism and combating money laundering. It's very important that we do that, but we cannot let that impact the possibility of people fighting for human rights to be able to live a dignified life in the country of their choosing.
Bill Browder is certainly a hero and a great man in the world, and again, probably not recognized as much as he should be. Because his life is at peril, I think, every moment of every day, just as Hodorkovsky's probably is as well. And he's been an aid or supporter of Bill's work, and he's to be commended. Tell me what you hear from your people about what's happening in Belarus. Is there any kind of a groups trying to form opposition to Lukashenko? Is that going on now?
So first of all, I don't call our democratic movement as opposition movement because we Belarusian people are majority who are opposing, regime of Lukashenko. For 30 years, Lukashenko built a system that serves him personally, his personal security apparatus, but it's not about people. Majority of Belarusians are against Lukashenko, against unification with Russia, against the war, in Ukraine. So, of course, after our uprising in 2020 and after unleashed brutal terror in Belarus, our movement inside the country went underground. But still, people are bravely act small acts of sabotage, inside the country. They, like our local intelligence, they provide us with information, what's going on the ground. They provide assistance to political prisoners and our brave military volunteers who fight in Ukraine shoulder to shoulder with Ukrainians. So those who fled Belarus, they can be more active. And, our task, those who live in exile at the moment and want to return home is to keep unity, strengthen our civil resistance, strengthen our civil society, our media, our human rights defending centers, to show European perspectives, for people, to show alternative to Ruski Mir and to Lukashenko, but also provide assistance to people inside the country. So believe me, I absolutely sure when the moment comes, there will be window of opportunity for Belarusian people. They will be on the streets again. But people on the streets is only small part of uprising and resistance. Hard work is being done now. We are weakening the regime, strengthening people. We are looking for new allies in the world. We are formalizing relationship with the democratic world. Like we launched strategic dialogue with the USA, for example. It's a very important step for us. We have groups for democratic Belarus in many, many parliaments. So we strengthen an agency of democratic forces. And for 4 years, Lukashenko, despite of the repressions, and tyranny, he didn't make Belarusian people like him again. And he knows this. He feels very fragile. He feels very insecure. Now what he's doing now, he's selling our country piece by piece to Russia. He doesn't take care about our independence, our sovereignty, our nation. So he's ruining our national identity. We see the process of Russification in Belarus. It means that Russia interferes in our media, economy, education. They erase any connection with Europe in our historic books. They, like Lukashenko with his hands erasing Belarus from the map of Belarus. So that's why resistance and uprising, it's not only the people on the streets. It's about movement, it's about unity, it's about solidarity, and it's about allies. No one war and no one fight cannot be won when you are alone. So we need allies, to stand with us. We are not asking the world to fight instead of us. Just strengthen us, be with us on this difficult path to democracy.
Was there, I can't recall exactly, but was there some attack on an individual in Lithuania recently, and maybe they thought it came from was it from Belarus? That ring a bell at all? A public attack, maybe the person got hit in the head.
Yeah, as I said, everybody is under attack, is target of regime, of Lukashenko. I suppose it was person from Navalny team. Yeah. But, you can't give policemen to every person, who live in exile. But we constantly produce, give instructions what to do when you think that you are, followed by somebody, that something's going on around you. So people, of course, have to take care of themselves. And, of course, we rely on, local security systems that verify people who enter in Lithuania, Poland, where most of Belarusians are located.
I was able to attend a forum at the Peace Institute recently. There were a great number of groups that were trying to get more issues and people in Russia to get freedom and democracy and to do what they can to encourage people. And what we heard is there's a lot of resistance in Russia. that there have been a lot of contributions in rubles as well as euros to help people that have been injured in Ukraine. That's been cut off some by the Russians, but there was a lot of contributions to these groups, which indicates obviously people that are not afraid of Russia and not afraid of speaking up. And as we speak of people that are not afraid of Russia and not afraid of speaking up, I would like to recognize and designate as the honorary member, as this Helsinki Commission, the great emeritus Speaker of the House of Representatives and one of the great leaders, female or male, in legislative affairs all over the world, Ms. Nancy Pelosi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for your kind words, for your great leadership on the the issues of concern to U.S. Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe. It's a very special day for us to have Svetlana come and testify in the Congress, along with your distinguished guest. Thank you, Madam, what do I call you, rapporteur in all of this. And again, the Freedom House, such wonderful advocates for freedom. Mr. Cohen and I just returned from Normandy. We were there to observe D-Day. We heard beautiful speeches about freedom, about the alliance that on that particular day turned the tide of the war in Europe and then persisted until freedom prevailed and justice was done. At the end of that war, it was noted that although Russia was part of the alliance that fought the Nazis at some point, it was also a country that took over so much territory after the war. And as we know, some years later, 1989, the Iron Curtain came down or went up, or the wall came down, whatever. But much of the injustice continues. Svetlana to us is just like the Statue of Liberty in life, just being so brave, so courageous, so stoic. I think about her, I pray for her, and I wonder how she is able to deal with the incarceration of her husband for such a long period of time and not knowing, as you have testified, what the situation is. But to go out there and galvanize women, especially in Belarus, to elect you president of the country, of course unable to assume the office because of the current occupant of that position with the support of President Putin. So please, all of you know how important your testimony is here, because we want to raise the awareness in our country of the situation in Belarus. We want to raise the support of the Congress to support the efforts there. And we want to shorten the distance between now and a time when Freedom House's goals will prevail in Belarus. So again, it's an honor, again, just fresh off of meeting so many of the surviving but lively veterans who were there, and the stories they told and the purpose that they served when they were kids. They were 17, 18, 19. The baby there was like 97. The oldest one I know from Baltimore, where I'm from, was 104. He was there. And but they all took great pride in what they did. But clearly the work is not done. And I thank you for that. I already have taken some guidance from Svetlana for things we can do here, both from a policy standpoint, from an appropriation standpoint, and from a communication standpoint. But nothing is more important than your official on the record to the Congress of the United States of the situation there. I don't know if you have any other comments that you would make as I yield back to the distinguished chairman, but welcome, Svetlana. It's an honor to know you, a privilege to be close up to see your courage firsthand, and we hope that we can find justice and freedom soon for your husband and for the people of Belarus.
We appreciate your coming to the hearing and expressing your thoughts. And Speaker Pelosi's been a leader through many years for freedom and for the Helsinki Commission, and we appreciate that. And if any of y'all have any things you want to ask or say to Speaker Pelosi, this is your chance.
No, I just, only want to convey the words of gratitude to you, dear Nancy Pelosi, for supporting us Belarusians on our difficult path to democracy, and now how you are personally, engaged into our cause and how much you are helping. And why I'm also optimistic about Belarus, that we have, I'm really blessed to have, we Belarusians really blessed to have such friends as you. So thank you for coming. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. I mentioned communication, appropriation, policy, and the rest. Also, organization, mobilization. We want to take advantage of the beautiful diaspora of people from Belarus in our country to be a resource to us in this fight. And let me, as I say before we go forward, because we've been joined by a distinguished member, say how really impressed I have been for decades of Mr. Cohen's support for expanding freedom in the world. And that's why he has taken on this responsibility at the USCE for those purposes. It's a broader agenda, but it all comes down to freedom. So thank you for your leadership.
You're welcome. Thank you for your kind words. Did either of y'all have something you'd like to address to Ms. Pelosi?
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Pelosi, for addressing us today and for speaking with us about this important topic. I'm invited here as the General Rapporteur on the position of political prisoners in the Council of Europe. It is an institution, an organization that was founded in the wake of the Second World War to prevent it from happening again. Sadly, when it came to the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, we failed, but what we have consequently done is expel Russia from the organization. I think we're the one and only organization internationally that have actually taken that step, and I'm quite proud of it because it doesn't belong in our organization when it invades a neighbor and a fellow member of the Parliamentary Assembly. What I would really like to convey is that I am very happy to be here on behalf of my organization of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. The United States has observer status to our organizations, and often we hear from legislative members of your great parliament in our deliberative assembly in the Council of Europe. Your active participation, Mr. Cohen, in the Parliamentary Assembly of the OSCE has, of course, heightened the visibility of the situation of political prisoners across the region. And I believe that with increased cooperation between the US Congress and Europe, as well as between the OSCE and the Council of Europe, we can combine our forces to highlight these stories and to help secure the release of political prisoners that really do need the combined efforts of democratic leaders such as ourselves to ensure their freedom. Thank you very much.
I'll be in Romania. Will you be in Romania?
I can try to make my way over there.
Give them hell.
And I would just add my thanks to the Speaker Emeritus, who I should note is also a Freedom House Leadership Award winner, perhaps one of her most important titles. We really appreciate your leadership on these issues, particularly related to human rights in China. And I know all three of you care deeply about this topic. Obviously, you're here today. Thank you for that. In addition to political prisoners, I would just ask that you all do what I know you're going to do and also focus on folks even after they're released and the restrictions they continue to face. And then I know in the United States, we're moving into a tough budget cycle, and you three know well that democracy assistance really does pay for itself, not just in the countries where we're working to support democracy and rights, but for all of us, since we know, as we've already talked about, the trickle effects of repression. And so thank you so much for the work that you three are doing to uphold a robust budget.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I'd like to recognize the chair, Mr. Wilson.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member. And, we could tell you that it's bipartisan. You see it right here, okay? And then I'm going to tell you a little known fact. I was really grateful that the Speaker is now wearing a U.S.-Ukraine pin. The very first U.S.-Ukraine pin she received was from me. And so...
Hey, and by the way, I have on my I have my Belarus freedom
Belarus, no,
pin
and
as
we
well, that I
recognize-
got from Svetlana yesterday.
See how she's ahead of the curve, having both pins. But very seriously, for the State of the Union address, she didn't appear to be properly dressed. So I made sure. So I made sure.
You didn't appear properly pinned.
Pardon me. Hey, see, he's so smart. But the bottom line, no, hey, it's bipartisan, our devotion for people of Central and Eastern Europe and around the world. And it's really bipartisan. And again, we're all so concerned about each country, but Madam President, and Belarus itself, how many political prisoners can be identified now, and what is the status of their confinement?
So at the moment, we know the names at least 1,500 political prisoners, but the real number is much, much higher because many prisoners who are detained for political motivated cases, they don't want to be recognized as political prisoners because the attitude to them in prisons is much, much worse. They are denied any medical help, they are denied parcels, they are denied books, like it's real, torturing, and very often relatives of these people don't appeal to human rights defenders to recognize them as political prisoners. Political prisoners, are marked with special yellow marks on their clothes, meaning that nobody among other prisoners can communicate to them. It's like full isolation, for people. They're humiliated constantly, physically and morally. So this is what it means, to be a political prisoner. And it means that your relatives, in freedom also will be attacked by the regime.
Well, I just want to thank you for your courage, and I also am so grateful for the Republic of Lithuania to host you. How courageous Lithuania is, and for the young people here, they wouldn't know, and even the speaker and Congressman Cohen and I weren't around when this occurred, but in 1940, the Red Army invaded the Baltic republics, and to the credit of the United States, we never recognized that Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were part of the Soviet Union. And so anytime they claimed to have 17 republics, we knew that was not true, because we knew 3 were clearly occupied, and America always recognized the independence of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Keeping that in mind, do we get to Russia? And for our 2 other colleagues, what is the status and how many political prisoners? And and the charges today against the Wall Street Journal reporter, again, what a reminder of the barbarity of the war criminal Putin's regime.
Thank you very much. Perhaps the most excessive violators of due process and those who conduct political imprisonments are Azerbaijan, Russia, Belarus, and Turkey, those countries that I focus on in Russia. In Europe, excuse me. So in Russia, what we consider to be political prisoners estimate over 1,000 at the moment. They have significantly increased since the full-scale invasion into Ukraine, where legislative measures have made it almost impossible to even hold up a white sign, as became quite famous, or speak your mind about the invasion or criticize Russia's involvement with it or its responsibility for it, more correctly. When it comes to Belarus, it has already been covered. We have a high number of political prisoners, very repressive regime that has also very much strengthened its repressive policies against the population after democratic protests and democratic movements in the country. When it comes to Azerbaijan, perhaps this is the most significant example of the revolving door that my colleague here referred to before. Azerbaijan has a consistent practice of imprisoning people, a few hundred at a time. At the moment, the current estimate is around 300 political prisoners in Azerbaijan, a rather small country. What they do is pardon a lot of people, especially around inconvenient occasions. For instance, when somebody starts talking about imposing sanctions or something like that, they will release some people. But then shortly thereafter, they will imprison some other people, and later on, they will pick up the people that they released. And this revolving door of Azerbaijan has been going on since before its accession to the Council of Europe. And I believe that many of our representatives in the Council of Europe are now seriously considering whether a country such as this really belongs in the Council of Europe and whether or not it should be expelled. When it comes to Turkey, Estimations vary. The highest estimate goes around 40,000 people imprisoned on political charges. Turkey has a widespread problem on the lack of independence of the judiciary and what we could call widespread political persecution. The failed coup attempt being a very handy excuse for cleaning out any real independent judges, academicals, people in public service, teachers, anyone really that might be considered a threat. This has a significant bearing on their membership status in the Council of Europe as well. They've repeatedly disregarded judgments of the European Court of Human Rights, which we hold in the very highest regards, and our member states are obliged to fulfill. The most prominent cases, of course, are Osman Kavala and Mr. Demirtas, who both have been recognized by the court as their detention being politically motivated. And they're also laureates. Mr. Kavala, he's a laureate of the Václav Havel Human Rights Prize, which is also a measure that we use to highlight the plight of political prisoners. Mr. Vladimir Kara-Murza got the prize in 2022 at my instigation, and we have awarded many political prisoners with this prestigious award. And I'm happy to hear that Yevgenia and Vladimir will be awarded tonight. I believe that Svetlana will be among the prize winners tonight as well. So I think it is also important to award people for their brave fight for democracy, because we can call political prisoners heroes for democracy, and we need to support them in their fight to preserve the democracy for all of us.
You're here. And your point of view?
Well, I would say that was a fantastic but grim tour around the world. On Russia, obviously, it's not just Evan Gershkovich who's imprisoned, but also Paul Whelan, Vladimir Kara-Murza, Ksenia Karolina, and Alsu Kurmasheva. These are all folks who are American nationals. And I do want to point out, if I may, that actually Alsu's husband is with us today, sitting right behind me, and I feel like I should give him a microphone. You know, the lengths that regime will go to exert pressure and pull political antics is unending. I would just add, you know, you've heard me mention civil death briefly, but this is a tactic that all of the governments that we just talked about use to exert pressure on folks, even when they are not in prison. So in Turkey, journalist Sofia Alagash, for example, she's a case that we advocate for. She has been released but is under house arrest and can't travel. Or Gubadi Badaglu, his documents have been seized, and so he can't obtain medical care that he needs since the hospital can't treat him without his documents. So it's not just imprisonment, it's travel bans, it's revocation of documents in country, but also when you travel abroad, they can revoke your passport. There's another great hero here from Nicaragua, Mr. Felix Maradiaga, and he has, you know, I should give him the microphone also, even though it's outside OSCE jurisdiction. So, you know, he can talk at great length about his own experience with revocation of documents and what a pressure that was on his family and when he was in incommunicado detention also. So these issues are really, again, we really appreciate you highlighting them because it makes folks unable to live a normal life.
Well, as I conclude, I want to thank each of you, but I appreciate you referencing sanctions. Hey, we're in the 21st century. We can now identify oligarchs. We can identify complicit individuals within governments who are conducting illegal operations. We can also identify the fruits of their corruption of villas or whatever around the world. And every effort, I believe, should be bipartisan to deter the corrupt conduct and use sanctions as a deterrence to promote freedom and democracy. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I would like to recognize each of you. Thank you for your heroism and your courage and for attending today. We have votes, I think, at 4:30.
Yeah, we have votes. If I just may.
Please.
If I may, again, salute you and
Mr. Wilson for his leadership and his attention and knowledge about all of these issues. As he was speaking and you were responding, I was remembering something that we, quoting ourselves, have always said, and that is one of the most excruciating forms of torture that these oppressors engage in is to tell the prisoners that nobody even remembers that they're there, and that they might as well just confess to what, who knows, but just to forget about it all and recognize that whatever they'd suffered, it was for nothing because nobody knows or cares anymore. And of course, that is not true. But we just want to make sure, and thank you for having this hearing to give visibility. And as the rapporteur talked about what the record is, and as Madam Vice President said and Madam President said about what's happening in at Freedom House and Madam President in Belarus, it's really important for us to keep naming the names, flying the flag of freedom for them. I myself want to just go on record as advocating for making Russia naming them a terrorist state, so that when we do the sanctions, they can have more heft. That's a different conversation for another day. But since we mentioned sanctions, I thought I would mention that. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Vladimir Kara-Murza started an effort to have Russia, Putin, not recognized as president. That is, the presidency would be illegitimate because he had to change the Constitution or go against the Constitution to continue in office. The European Commission has, I think, declared that, and we have a bill in Congress to do the same, and it was inspired by Vladimir, and it's in this Foreign Relations Committee, Foreign Affairs Committee. So we're going to work on that as well, and we're trying to get Ukraine, what's happened there, to be declared a genocide, which is what Russia's doing. Taking all those children, there was a big story, I think it was in the Times this week. Did you see the picture? They had all the pictures of all the children.
Oh, the children.
And
It's
how
so
they've
sad.
taken, and when you take the children, you're taking away the nation. I mean, it's a crime against the parent, but it's a crime against the country, and they're trying to Russify them. So, yes, sir.
And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to point out you're ahead of the curve again, in that I'm putting it in the congressional record today, an extension of remarks identifying the legislation that you and I have introduced about the illegitimacy of the Putin regime. And in particular, we have a very highly respected author, professor, journalist, David Satter, who has written a book, The Less You Know, the Better You Sleep, Russia's Road to Terror and Dictatorship under Vladimir Putin, and it documents how Putin came to power through fabricated attacks across the country. And so this will be put in the congressional record today. I'm really impressed that the chairman is ahead of the curve again. Thank you.
We're kind of the odd couple. I don't know who's Felix and who's Oscar, but
But all three of us were in Normandy. And that, I started my remarks by saying you have the Normandy symbol there.
Again, indicating the alliance we have with France, the United Kingdom, and Canada. Thank you.
one thing I saw that was beautiful yesterday is at the French embassy, the French ambassador's home, they have a statue in front, and it's draped in the
Statue of Liberty.
and it's draped in the Ukrainian flag.
Yes.
It's really beautiful. And it's what Ms. Baker Pelosi was saying, and we've repeated what Vladimir has said, that the worst thing that can happen to a political prisoner is to be forgotten. That's basically the theme of Elie Wiesel's first great book, Night, and memory is so important. And that's one of the reasons he wrote that, was for people to remember what happened in the Holocaust and not to let it be forgotten. With that, I thank everybody. We're going to get ready for votes, and I declare this meeting adjourned.
And if we could get a picture of the three of us with the three of them, please.
Thank you. This is an impressive book.
Political prisoners, there's no reason to talk about political prisoners, right?
Mrs.
My pen here, this is the name of my wife who is in prison. She has been in prison in Russia for 8 months now.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
American journalist, really fear.
Thank you for
Chairman
coming.
Cohen, thank you very much for your support. I very much appreciate your support.
Oh, my. 8 months.
Yeah, she's been denied phone calls with her daughters. She has 2 daughters.